Honorable consellera Verge, il·lustre síndica Jiménez Salinas, secretaris, varios i vàries, estimades tots i totes, benvinguts i bona tarda a tothom a l'acte d'avui en nom del Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis de la Generalitat de Catalunya. Com alguns de vosaltres ja sabeu i ens coneixeu, el Centre d'Estudis pertany al Departament d'Acció Exterior i Unió Europea de la Generalitat de Catalunya i és una unitat dedicada a l'anàlisi, a la reflexió, al debat sobre assumptes contemporanis, valgui la redundància, amb un interès particular per la realitat que passa més enllà de les nostres fronteres. Això inclou tant temes d'actualitat principalment política, econòmica i social, com aquelles temàtiques, podríem dir-ne, més de fons, aquelles que passen diguem-ne per sota, més enllà de l'actualitat, per sota de l'actualitat o malgrat l'actualitat i que en tot cas tenen efectes sobre la mateixa, la modifiquen, etc. El centre també té un interès particular pel futur, que es concreta en un cultiu del que es coneix com a prospectiva estratègica. La prospectiva és una manera sistemàtica i organitzada de mirar el futur i la prospectiva analitza contextos, identifica tendències, anticipa possibles disrupcions i elabora escenaris de futur per orientar les polítiques públiques i la presa de decisions. I tot això es concreta, tot això que us deia, es concreta en tota l'activitat que fem i entre aquesta activitat hi ha la publicació de la Revista IDEES, que és el que ens aplega avui aquí. La Revista IDEES va ser creada fa 25 anys, va aparèixer per primer cop. L'Àngel Castiñera, en aquell moment era el director del centre, la va crear i des d'aleshores ha anat sortint de forma ininterrompuda, amb més o menys regularitat i amb unes preocupacions que han anat variant al llarg del temps en funció una mica del context i del moment polític del país i del món. Després de molts anys d'una publicació únicament en paper i després d'uns quants anys més de publicació únicament també només en digital, avui tenim la gran sort i la gran il·lusió de poder-vos anunciar que, ja ho heu vist allà, tornem a aparèixer en paper i ho fem conviure amb lo digital. Lo digital, a més, que ho podeu, aquí teniu un QR, vull dir que si ho marqueu aquí podeu veure també l'edició en digital. I també us anunciem que a partir de l'any que ve us oferirem la revista, us oferirem la possibilitat de subscriure-us a la revista, és a dir, farem la revista també per subscripció. Tornem al monogràfic que us explicava ara. Vull destacar-vos 4 coses del monogràfic d'avui. La primera és que el monogràfic té com a objectiu contribuir a la commemoració compromesa i al mateix temps crítica també del 75 aniversari de la Declaració Universal dels Drets Humans, un document que, com bé sabeu tots, va ser adoptat el 48 després per l'Assemblea General de les Nacions Unides en un moment en què les ferides de la Segona Guerra Mundial encara estaven obertes, suporaven, les bombes encara fumejaven i la violència encara era molt, molt, molt recent. I a 75 anys d'aquella fita inicial i havent contribuït de forma decisiva i indubtable a fer d'aquest món un lloc una mica millor, és imperatiu renovar el nostre compromís amb aquests valors universals, especialment en un moment en què el món s'ha enfosquit, les guerres tornen a proliferar, hi ha més amenaces globals que mai i com alerta el nostre ponent d'avui, a l'article que publiquem al monogràfic, en un moment en què el consens universal respecte a aquests valors i aquests principis, els drets humans, sembla que està retrocedint. Aquesta commemoració d'avui, per tant, no només és un recordatori del passat i un agraïment sentit també a tots aquells que ens han precedit en la lluita de la construcció d'un món millor, sinó una crida també a l'acció present i futura. Una crida a treballar junts a través de fronteres que ens separen i malgrat les diferències que ens allunyen per garantir que els drets humans siguin una realitat tangible per tothom. Una crida a tots i cadascun de nosaltres a defensar amb vehemència els drets fonamentals, les institucions democràtiques i l'estat de dret en el nostre dia a dia també i a promoure d'aquesta manera la dignitat i el respecte per a tots els éssers humans. La segona cosa que voldria destacar del monogràfic és la qualitat també de les contribucions dels seus autors, dels quals ens acompanyen uns quants avui aquí, el mateix ponent, però també en Mustafa Chaimi, l'Adriana Ribas, la Simona Levi, el Carlos Castilla. I també voldria destacar-ne les fotografies. Veureu que el monogràfic incorpora molt material gràfic també. Les fotografies de l'Alessio Mamo, que és fotoperiodista sicilià i que ha estat guardonat en moltes ocasions, en diverses ocasions, amb múltiples premis internacionals. I podríem dir que la seva mirada incisiva i compromesa és una contribució més al monogràfic. És muda, però és molt expressiva. I finalment, la tercera cosa que voldria destacar és la coordinació conjunta d'aquest monogràfic entre el Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis, que represento jo, i la Direcció General per la Promoció i la Defensa dels Drets Humans del Departament d'Igualtat i Feminismes. A qui vull agrair especialment haver-nos acompanyat en aquesta empresa i motiu pel qual també demano llavors a l'Adam Major, el director general de Drets Humans per la Promoció i la Defensa dels Drets Humans, perquè us dirigeixi unes paraules. Li demano que vingui a l'estrada. Moltes gràcies.
Hola, bona nit a tothom, benvinguts, gràcies per venir. Jo seré molt breu, un parell de coses. Una, la primera, que ens ha agradat molt treballar amb l'Institut de Drets Humans de Catalunya. L'Institut de Catalunya també ens ha agradat molt treballar-hi i també hi treballem molt, però en aquest cas amb el Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis. Gràcies per fer-ho tan fàcil, perquè no sempre passa, quan es treballa interdepartamentalment, no sempre les coses són tan senzilles i en aquest cas ho ha sigut molt, hi ha hagut molt bona sintonia des del primer moment i això és important. I aprofito a més per posar en valor organismes com el Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis, perquè a vegades hi ha qui pensa que la reflexió, l'anàlisi, el debat, això ho ha de fer la universitat o ho han de fer determinades institucions més o menys privades, i és cert, ho han de fer també, però també ho ha de fer l'administració pública, perquè si l'administració pública no pensa en ella mateixa, no pensa en la societat, no fa prospectiva, no s'imagina com serà la societat en el futur, partint d'analitzar-la de com és ara a l'actualitat, difícilment l'encertarà, perquè la majoria de coses que fem els poders públics no tenen una repercussió immediata, la tenen al llarg dels anys. I per tant, si no ho fem des d'un coneixement el més profund i el més encertat possible, difícilment encertarem les tendències i per tant encertarem què ha de passar en el futur. Ja és difícil encertar-ho, però com a mínim així anem amb ulls, no anem cecs a l'hora de preveure polítiques. I en aquest sentit aprofito també per explicar que al llarg d'aquest any, al llarg del 24, elaborarem un document que li direm Pla Estratègic de Drets Humans per a la Catalunya del 2030, que és un document que l'hem elaborat o que l'elaborarem, l'estem elaborant des del govern, des dels diferents departaments, però que el volem també compartir i posar a debat amb el teixit de defensa dels drets humans, que moltes de les persones que esteu aquí el representeu i que per nosaltres és molt important també aquest treball amb la societat i aquest treball de pensar com ens volem en el futur. L'administració pública no pot només actuar en el present, sinó que ha de fer, inevitablement acaba fent-ho i per tant ho ha de fer conscientment, treballar també pensant en el futur. I per últim, dir-vos que si portem avui en Christos Giakoumopoulos, no és només perquè és una persona que de drets humans en sap molt, que hi ha reflexionat molt, que hi ha treballat molt i que té un coneixement profund i extens, sinó també perquè representa el Consell d'Europa i perquè les institucions, les estructures, el dret internacional de defensa dels drets humans és molt important i s'ha de posar en valor cada vegada que en tinguem l'oportunitat. Sovint ens sembla que són institucions llunyanes, a vegades potser anacròniques, i no ho són en absolut. Són institucions millorables i que segurament en algunes coses es podrien actualitzar i es podrien reforçar encara més, però són institucions imprescindibles. El dret internacional, les institucions internacionals de defensa dels drets humans, en aquest cas el Consell d'Europa, són institucions molt necessàries que cal donar a conèixer, que cal posar en valor, que cal reconèixer la feina que fan i que per tant és important també que amb aquest acte d'avui reconeguem no només la feina del senyor Giakoumopoulos, sinó també la institució que representa en aquest cas el Consell d'Europa. havia de presentar també a la Cristina Mas, que és qui conduirà l'acte en format de diàleg, com sabeu. Endavant, Cristina.
Bé, doncs, bona tarda a totes. Primer, uns petits apunts. Teniu traducció anglès i català amb els aparells. El català està al canal 1 i l'anglès està al canal 2. I us demanaré, sisplau, que silencieu, recordeu silenciar els telèfons mòbils. M'ha tocat presentar Christos Giakoumopoulos. Ell és director general de Drets Humans i Estat de Dret al Consell d'Europa des de fa més de 6 anys. Abans havia estat director de Drets Humans i l'assessor per a Ucraïna del seu secretari general. També ha estat director general d'Afers Legals del Banc de Desenvolupament del Consell i havia treballat al Tribunal Europeu de Drets Humans, va ser vicesecretari executiu de la Convenció de Venècia i el primer director de l'oficina del primer comissionat de Drets Humans, Álvaro Gil Robles, per tant una trajectòria molt llarga. Farem aproximadament una horeta de conversa, tenim una sèrie de preguntes, però ja sabeu que quan els periodistes tenim guions, després les converses se'n van per on ens porten i a continuació us passarem la paraula perquè pugueu fer també les vostres preguntes i comentaris. So, good evening, Mr. Giakoumopoulos, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am grateful for the opportunity to discuss a topic that stands out as one of the most urgent and vital matters of our times. As we reflect on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a challenging question that surfaces. Would this same declaration, which has shaped the narrative for human rights over the past 75 years, receive approval in 2023? In the course of our live conversation, let's not only revisit history, but also explore its implication for our present and future. I am sure your expertise in the field will enrich us all. I am looking forward to navigating this dialogue with you, and I am confident it will be a frank and open conversation, especially considering that, as I have been told, you are about to retire. So it seems you will be free to speak. Easier, yes. My first question is about what you are witnessing now in Israel and Palestine. Some days ago, the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Craig McKeever, he resigned. And in his resignation letter, he stated this was a protest against what he called United Nations failure to prevent what he calls a textbook case of genocide we are seeing nowadays. So, where are we today?
Okay, let me start with something easier. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Contemporary Studies, of course, for the very kind invitation and for giving me this opportunity to speak. On my personal capacity, I would like to say I was a little bit puzzled with what you said, that I represent the Council of Europe. I don't necessarily have a clearance for everything I will say, but you asked me to be frank, so I will try to combine the two, but it's not always easy. And in particular, on the question that you have raised, I would say, well, first of all, let's say, this is outside the remit of the Council of Europe. And I think that we should not forget that. It is, of course, one of the most challenging situations that the international community is facing, has faced over the last, I think, several decades. And it is essentially challenging because it is divisive. It is divisive because it creates, or it is generated by conflictual situations, not the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, of course, but conflicting even human rights positions. And I think that this is what is at the center of what we see today. As I said, human rights everywhere today. We see that we have many institutions that relate to human rights, national, regional, international, specific ones for specific rights, general ones, judicial ones and non-judicial ones, and civil society is extremely active. So the human rights narrative is everywhere, almost every day. And at the same time, it is probably one of the periods of time that we have most challenges on human rights. It's very difficult to explain this. I don't have... Apart perhaps from the fact that it is sometimes used in a very distortive way. We put a human rights source on everything that we feel. Whatever we like is human rights compatible. Whatever we dislike is a violation of human rights. And that creates, of course, confusion. I think that what we have lost, perhaps, sight of is that human rights is about governance. It's about the relations between the citizen, the individual, and those who exercise power, in particular, whatever kind of power this is. And it is there to regulate these relations in a way that is agreed on the basis of some principles. And this notion, which is transcribed into international treaties, constitutions, laws, has provided
with the sound.
Is it my problem?
Is it okay? Yes? Good, go ahead, please.
Okay. That this is something that has provided at least the European continent with a peaceful life, prosperity, stability over more than 70 years. We do not explain well, or we do not explain enough why this is the case, or how did human rights have a role in this respect. And I think that this is part of the extreme proliferation of narratives that are create confusion. And also, they not only create confusion, but also give room for challenges. And I can come back to that if you want. Now, on the question that you have raised, failures of the international community, failures of government, failures of individuals, responsibilities for can be sought in many places. I think that it is a tragedy that could perhaps have been avoided, but it is always easy to speak afterwards, isn't it?
The director was mentioning before, quoting you in your article, when you said that the consensus on human rights protection is losing strength. Why are we seeing these dynamics?
Yes, I think that it is losing strength precisely because we have not been able to make over these 70, 75 years, to make the link between the stability and the prosperity and the human rights. We have not been able to show that. And we have taken it also for granted, in particular for younger people, younger generations. This is something that is granted. Death penalty. Just to give an example, we were just in the cell where the last death penalty was carried out in 74, I think. 74 to now, it's 50 years. It's 2 generations. There are people who may be in favor of death penalty today in Europe, probably because they have never seen it and they have never felt it. And they were, because our societies feel completely preserved from this kind of things. So human rights can backslide. And it is important to be vigilant and to be always ready to recommit, as Pau has said. So I think this is the first reason, that we are used to that. We don't feel the need to fight for them any longer. So it's something that we consider for granted. There's also another reason, is that I think we consider sometimes human rights as an ideology. Human rights is, we can be in favor or against. Actually, it's not an ideology. Ideology means that I can be in favor or be against, or those who are against me are violate human rights. I think that we are missing the essence, the very essence, which is human rights is a process which guarantees to everyone the right to participate in the governance of his environment, to be a citizen, to be one that benefits from a series of rights, to be one that has trust to institutions, and one who is trusted by the institutions and who can also influence the institutions. There are not good and bad citizens in human rights. And so the idea of using a human rights narrative to promote ideologies, geopolitical interests or ambitions, as we sometimes have done as Westerners, I would say, is something that has damaged the notion of human rights.
Yeah, I work very much in the Arab world and the Mediterranean region, and you see always this idea of these double standards from the West, which I think really damages the capacity of leverage, no? In a point.
I didn't use the word double standards. I'm just saying.
I use it.
Okay. Yes, but I really think that it is important not to qualify as human rights compatible everything we like, and as a human rights violation everything we dislike. I think that this empties the notion of human rights from its constitutional value as a rule that governs the relations between the state and the individual. The power and those who are governed, if I may say so. And that can be at any level. It could be a state and the citizen, it could be the region and the citizen, it could be a big enterprise and a citizen and a worker or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So, apart from considering rights for granted, which are never granted in any way, neither human rights, are there other reasons you see behind this loss of strength of the Declaration issued 75 years ago?
Yes, as I said, the fact that by transforming this by giving the impression that human rights is an ideological fight, we give the impression that you can be in favor or be against, and that this is something that you may notice that the word human rights is not used so much in the European Parliament, for instance. They say fundamental liberties. There is a bad connotation about human rights. It's for Latin America, for Asia, not for Europe. So I think that this is something that we need to avoid. I think that we need to stress that we are in a field where human rights is something that has built a peaceful Europe for the first time after centuries, for more than 70 years. If any of us could look back into his family, I'm sure that his grandfather has, or perhaps even the previous generations, have been under war for years and years and have suffered from war. We are in an extremely privileged situation, and I think that this is the experience of the Second World War and the fact that European societies and the European integration at the end has been based on this very notion of human rights. And I would even add to that it is based on the collective guarantee of human rights, so in a multilateral aspect of protection of human rights. Because human rights, fundamental freedoms were already in a constitutions of most European states that entered war before the Second World War, or between the war period. What is the main, let's say, the main lesson learned from the Second World War is that this is not enough. It is the collective guarantee, the multilateralism, the international aspect where human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are not an issue for one state, for one community. It is an issue for which every state and every community should care. And I think that this is what has built this peace over the years.
When we look at the situation of human rights protection in Europe, which fields would you say that Europe is doing well? Where does it need to improve? And where would you see a regression?
Well, Europe does well in many, in every field, I would say. But let me say something. I think that there's always room for improvement on human rights. And I think that what is basic is not whether you do well or whether you do not so well, but that whenever you face a human rights problem, a rule of law problem, or a democracy problem, you can identify it as a state and take steps to remedy it. I think the distinction is not between those who violate human rights and those who don't. I mean, we all have problems with human rights in every society in Europe. I think that the most important is that when there are these problems, you just don't close your eyes to it. You look into them and you take steps to remedy them. Now, you said, what are the areas where Europe has to improve? If I had to choose one, I would say discrimination and stereotypes, because this is a long-standing issue which has linked to European history, and I think that this is something that needs to be, is a long process and needs to be tackled from various comprehensive angles so that there is an improvement there. Luckily enough, the younger generation is very much on it. So I think that this is quite important. And you said also which fields Europe has suffered regression. In my view, it's on migration and detention. Migration because I would actually link the two. When we have now situations where any foreigner, let's put it like this, I'm not saying whether it's migrant or asylum seeker or a refugee, any foreigner who would arrive on the territory of a state is likely to be detained, deprived of their liberty for months, sometimes going up more than 10 months, perhaps even 20 months. When this is also applied to children, I think that we have a regression which also affects our own perception of the world. You know, 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, the idea of a picture in Europe where you would see children behind barbed wire would have been unbearable. We are getting used to it. We see children in prison without any reason, by the way. I mean, they have not committed anything. They just crossed the border. So I think that this is something that we are lagging behind there. We have some regression, and we need to address that very seriously. Why do we reach this situation?
I have the feeling, I don't know if you agree with that, but the idea that this particular issue you mentioned now, it's like making a little bit prisoners, all of us also. I mean, there is a normalization of this kind of like state violence on helpless people. And you see, I've been working, as I told, in the Mediterranean for the last 15 years, and you see that this level of violence is increasing and being normalized as something that nobody's, almost nobody's challenging, no? It's like...
Yeah, I think you are right. I mean, it's this normalization of a situation which we were not used to it, but it's becoming normal. I think that this is an issue, and has to do, of course, with a number of positions. That's why the narrative about human rights is important. That is why the narrative of human rights is important. The idea of considering that we have an area and whoever is coming in is by definition a criminal and can be rejected as a person or be deprived of fundamental rights is a notion that comes in, affects also our own perception of ourselves. And I think that this is where things become really risky, if I may say so, for the future of our democracies, actually. I don't mean that I have a solution to that. I'm just worried. I'm just worried.
There is also, concerning migration, I want to go deeper on that, this agreement with third countries that are being like normalized, and with a new migration pact now we are seeing it has been enlarged. It was, I would say, pretty much a Spanish-made idea, because it came from, the first agreement came from the Spanish like 20 years ago, but it's being generalized, and we have more and more countries who don't fulfill any kind of human rights standard who are being considered as partners for European countries and European institutions to deal with migration issues.
Yes, but what I would like to say on this is that we have to distinguish between two things. The one is, I believe, migration management, because I think that this is something that any state has to deal with, also from a demographic perspective. I mean, Europe is becoming older, so there are plenty of aspects that would come into it. From these, let's say, fundamental rights, human rights perspective, whatever the migratory policy is, it has to be compatible with human rights. I think this is part of what we have built over years. So some fundamental principles should be respected. You cannot send someone to a place where he would be subject to torture. I mean, this is something that European institutions and actually courts in member states and institutions in member states all over Europe have been defending over the years. You cannot send someone back to a place where he will be put on orbit and will be moving from one place to another place. These are essential principles. We now are in a situation where some aspects may become more tricky also from a rule of law perspective. You may have situations where the legislator, for instance, would consider a place safe. By definition. Is this the right way? Is this a rule of law? This is something that will need to be considered. Let me just make a distinction between the humanitarian aspect, which is essentially an asylum procedure, for which the Geneva Convention is responsible, and which is also a treaty which has a role after the World War II, and the human rights perspective, which is different. The human rights perspective is actually to avoid that someone is subject to fundamental violations of human rights by this sending someone back. But from the Geneva Convention, there is a rule, the no pushbacks, consideration of applications for asylum. All these are somehow overlapping, but there is also a difference between the two. I would, if I could put it in one way, and I beg for your indulgence if I'm not corresponding, Cristina, to what you would like to listen. For the Council of Europe, if you are sent, for the European Convention of Human Rights, if you are sent to a place where you will not be subject to torture for sure, and you will be received properly as a refugee or as asylum seeker or as a migrant, it's not a problem. But it could still be a pushback under the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, very true. I'm sorry because I'm speaking too much on migration because this is my field, and maybe the audience will like us to move to other issues. I mean, one of the causes for migration we are seeing, we are seeing worsening and deepening is the climate change issue, the climate emergency we said now, because change is not a word anymore. So, and this is linked to migrations also, no? What are in your view, or what should be climate change related rights that are enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights?
Yes, I think that this is a very important challenge, and it needs to be addressed. I mean, climate change, climate urgency is a real challenge. Now, the other challenge is whether we can address that effectively from a human rights perspective. I think these are two issues. First of all, I believe, and I think that this is clear, and every administration has accepted to some extent, at least it is in the Reykjavik Declaration of states, of heads of states and government of the Council of Europe, adopted recently in May this year, that human rights, that the protection of the environment, that the right to an environment is threatened by a triple crisis, as they say: pollution, loss of biodiversity, and climate change. And that this has an impact on human rights, even civil and political rights as we feel them today. So the right to life, the right to health, the right not to be subject to inhuman treatment. So a number of liberties are connected to this. There are, of course, a number of issues. Also, how do you address this? Is it a right of actual generations? Is it the right of future generations? Can we already now say something about the right of future generations? How this can be linked to the right of abortion that we have been discussing for years between the 80s and the 90s, and there was a decision about that. So does this create a new debate? That's one part. And the other part is, if there is a right to healthy environment, and there is, I mean, it's not the question, is it actionable in a judicial manner? Can you complain about that before courts? And who can complain? Usually the victims of human rights may complain of that. Who is the victim of the victim of pollution is well known. It's the neighbor to the polluting source. But who is the victim of the loss of biodiversity? I mean, you are a victim of, and I am also, but all of us are victims. Can we all complain to the courts about loss of biodiversity because bats or cats or are destroyed? Can we complain about the climate change? Can you complain against Catalonia, for instance, if you are a citizen of the Maldives and you feel that the behavior of the Catalan government, of the Spanish government, of the European Union is damaging and creates storms and waves? And I think that these are very serious questions that we need to look into. Actually, the Council of Europe is now looking into three aspects, I would say. First of all, whether it is possible to have the right to a healthy and sustainable environment enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights, which would make the right to an environment liable to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. By the way, there are already cases about that, but they do not rely on a specific right, they rely on the right to life, more generally. The second aspect is whether we could use this, we could use another instrument like the European Social Charter. The European Social Charter has some advantages on that. For instance, you don't need to exhaust domestic remedies before applying for the European Social Charter. It is an application, a request that any NGO can make, or not any, those who are recognized, let's put it, who can complain about a policy. So not necessarily about being a victim, but for a policy, and say that this is incompatible with the European Social Charter. And it is true also that the right to environment is more likely to be linked from its nature to social rights, because these are rights where you don't expect the government to not to do something, but to do. It's not an obligation not to interfere, but rather an obligation to take a positive step. So this is perhaps where we stand. But there is also an option to have a completely new treaty with a new body that would look into that. All these options are there. The only thing, and it's one of the areas where the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has been unanimous, actually. They have unanimously requested member states, governments, to put in place a system, binding one. As always, the international community takes time, but it is interesting to see that there are judgments of national courts which make the link between the results and conclusions and commitments taken in the COPs and the right to environment. There was a decision of the High Administrative Court in the Netherlands some years ago, and I thought that last week there was also a decision of a Belgian court, actually, about that. So it is interesting to see that there is a litigation going on, and that this could accelerate, let's say, things at the international level. If I could conclude on that, I think that it is not because a court says it that actions need to be taken. I believe that it is the executive and the legislator need to be more active on that before the courts. The courts may only come afterwards. I mean, if the protection of environment is entirely left to the courts, we are not in a very good situation.
I would like you to comment a little bit on the issue of the freedom of the press and the right to truthful information. We have many wars going on, but two major ones, and in both of them, that we see that fake news and the role of misinformation is like a battlefield as important as the territorial one. No? Why do you think that there is that big challenge? I mean, why freedom of press is on the spot, and what can be done about that also?
Freedom of expression is the core of democracy, actually, and if it is, and freedom of information, because actually we discussed that at the beginning. I mean, if citizens, voters, if you want, have confidence to the democratic institution, it is because they believe that they are free to make a choice, and they are only free to make a choice if they are well informed. If they are not well informed, they make the choice that is almost pre-made previously for them. Disinformation is part of this, is part of the challenging of the democracy. Circulating censorship, self-censorship, violence against journalists, slaps, abusive action against the journalists. All these are part of this, the same process of diminishing the capacity of the citizens to make an informed decision about what needs to be done. So it is so much linked to the democracy that it's part of the checks and balances. Democracy does not mean dictatorship of the majority. It means that the majority needs to respect some rules. When the executive, or when the parliament eventually, need to have more room and less checking, less watchdogs to take some action, then they need to control the information. So if we have a tendency to have more concentration, less checks and balances, this means that we go towards more control of the information and more disinformation and more threats on journalists. It's an issue about democracy. What do we do about that? Well, on journalists, because I think this is one of the key issues here, we have suggested, and I think since 2016 there is a clear recommendation of the Committee of Ministers, accepted by all member states, by the way, with some principles. Among them, there is a need to have an action plan for the protection of journalists. I think that what is needed above all is that the democratic forces in every country realize that the journalists are key partners for democracy, and that they are under threat. It's not they are subject to harassment, and sometimes even to much more obvious threat. I mean, you remember the case of the investigative journalists in Malta. And others. Mm-hmm. And the numbers of people who lose their lives in Europe because they exercise investigative journalism are increasing. So I think that this is something that the executive and the legislature needs to take seriously. It's a question of quality of democracy. The second aspect, I think, is that there is a need to guarantee somehow the pluralism of information, concentration of media, and above all, I think, transparency as to media ownership needs to become a key issue for every democratic government. If we manage to do these two things, then what will be left is the issue of the loss of impact of the traditional media outlet compared to what we have now. I mean, younger generations are much more accustomed to have information from the internet. And I think that this is, at the same time, an extraordinary tool, and at the same time, it can become a tool for manipulation. First of all, because it is an extraordinary tool, and you don't need to, for freedom of information, freedom of expression, you don't need to think very much about that. An obvious indication is that all dictatorships in the world try to limit internet. So, I mean, it's quite clear that It is a threat.
Mm-hmm.
It is a threat in favor of democracy against totalitarian regimes. At the same time, it has some risks because it concentrates information on some aspects only. I'm sure that if all the information that I get, all the messages that I get, half of them relate to the Council of Europe, and I'm sure that this is not your case. So it is clear that the information that we receive through the internet is very much directed on the issues that we like.
Yeah, like bubbles, no?
There are bubbles, and then within these bubbles there are people who communicate, but they don't communicate with any other bubble. And that creates, at the same time, a lot of information and at the same time isolation. This is how we need to, this is an issue that we need to deal with. Again, it's a long-term perspective. I would say two things. The first one is for the younger generation, but also for the older ones, there's an absolute need to have social media and internet literacy to understand when you see an information whether this is an important information or not, whether it is manipulated or not, whether it comes from a valid source. I mean, older people in my age, when they see a video, they believe that it is true, inevitably. It's obvious not the case any longer. You can have plenty of videos which are fake. So I think this kind of understanding must be taught already in schools, so that people can make the distinction between what they see, what they receive as information, that they can compare it with other information and be fully informed of what is happening. We're not there yet. It takes a long time. The other one is to push a little bit the media platforms, media internet platforms, internet providers, in introducing the diversity of information as part of their artificial intelligence ways of distributing information. For the time being, it's only economic criteria, or essentially economic criteria. They will send information to those who are interested by this information, because in that way they have more people who see it, and this increases their capacity to make profits. But if, in addition to that, they introduce a criterion of diversity of information, then that would be a big progress, I think. We try to work with the internet platforms on this in the Council of Europe, have a partnership with the biggest of them. I think that is something they are very sensitive about, actually, because they feel that this is an issue. So we will see self-regulation, but not only, is one of the topics that we need to deal with.
What is your view on the ban of some Russian outlets in Europe? This was not in my question.
The media outlets, Russian media outlets in Europe, I mean, no, they are banned now. Most of them. Of course, there are. How do you define the influence? There are also other internet or radios or whatever who provide some information about what is some information which is not necessarily the one that we would like to have. But this is information. It is information. I think that the countering information is by countering disinformation is through more information, not by through censorship. I wouldn't go as far as saying that this was a wrong decision, because there is a country, member of state of the Council, which is on war. And on the war, in the war, you know what they say. I mean, the first victim of the war is truth. But I'm not going into that field. I just feel that there is, when you are in a situation of war, you need to control some information. That seems to me logical. And therefore, this is something that could be taken. By the way, all human rights instruments provide for this kind of limitations. So, provided that they are done in accordance with some rules again. So, if you are not in war, for instance, but you fear that there will be a war, or you create a kind of fear that there will be a war to your population, this is manipulation. You can restrict freedom of expression and freedom of information by creating artificially a kind of fear of war. But if you are in a war, when you have an invasion, when you face victims every day, bombs, I think that there's no way to do it.
And then I would like to move to a broader question about the exclusion of Russia from the Council of Europe. The reasons and what are the effects, in your view, the consequences of that?
Well, the reasons for that are obvious. I think it's because of a fundamental violation of the Statute of the Council of Europe. I'm in the unfortunate, or perhaps in the fortunate position, to say that my own country is the only one that has been expelled from the Council of Europe, which is not technically true, but nonetheless. We have two situations. The one is a country that has invaded another country, and it's not in conformity with the Statute of the Council of Europe. And we have a country that has said that it has established a dictatorship to protect the country from the communist danger, risk, back in the 60s. This was not in accordance with the statute. Both were expelled. Well, Russia was expelled. Greece has left just some hours before being expelled. But the result is the same.
The junta left. I was not aware of that. They left before.
Yes, but I mean, it was obvious that they left because it was better to leave rather than to
be expelled.
So there was always an opportunity for the dictatorship, for the dictator at the time to explain that Greece left the Council of Europe because the Council of Europe has lost its direction, and it is now in favor of communism. At the time, that was the By the way, the same narrative came also in this dictatorship, because it was in favor of LGBT, because it was in favor of against the family. All these narratives that are on the basis of the, let's say, anti-human rights, anti-democratic, anti-rule of law elements are everywhere, all the time, everywhere. They are the same. It's quite astonishing that they are not so inventive at the end.
It's true. Now you mentioned this on the domain of human rights and LGBTQ rights. There seems to be a backlash that surprised me a lot. I mean, I can understand why racism is increasing. No, you are against that, but you can see the reasons behind, no? But this idea of bringing back the old conservative macho ideas, no, the tradition. I mean, where does it come from, and why are they looking for it? What is the reason behind driving this? Because it's, as you said, you see it from Latin America to China, no? It's.
I think it's about populism. It's exploitation of the stereotypes. It's exploitation of because it's not the question, are you in favor of this or the other action? No? I mean, are you in favor of gay marriage or against gay marriage, for instance? Because this is a discussion that could take place. But the fact that you are against anything that has to do with LGBT rights promotion is something that is about exploiting, quite often for very petty political reasons, the stereotypes that exist still in European societies. And I think that this is the key issue. It's about populism. By the way, it's not only European society, it's more general. You can see that also in the Americas in particular, but also in Asia. I'm not aware about Africa, actually. I must say that sometimes the Africans are much more evolved in some aspects than Europe. But I would just like to say that this exploitation of stereotypes, of prejudice that exist even implicitly in the minds of, for historical reasons or whatever, in the minds of our societies, is a characteristic of populism. And populism actually is not about looking into issues that would please the people. I mean, this is how it is, actually every government should look into things that would please the people. I mean, this is what they are there for. They are there to serve the people, isn't it? So they must care about what the people think, about how they believe. But the populist movements actually, they don't recognize that there is a choice. The difference is that you don't say, this is how I would promote a society, and I understand that you have a different view. It's that they believe that the only way of promoting the society or of governing is their idea, and the other is not a different idea, but is a traitor, is someone who will destroy actually the country, the people, the community, or whatever. So it's becoming polarized and not respectful, and that is why it is dangerous for democracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to Russia if you like. I don't know if you finished the argument about Russia. It was okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
No, so with this argument of scapegoating, I understand that, but is it the same for women's rights?
I think yes, it's in the same logic. It's not so visible, but actually it's the same thing. When we see how the discussions that have been launched about the Istanbul Convention in the Council of Europe, which is a convention about violence against women, domestic violence, it has created a tremendous debate, sometimes completely unreasonable, about the constitutionality of this treaty, as if it could have been possible to find reasons to consider that the constitution of any state in the Council of Europe, because of the rights that it enshrines, would be against a treaty that would guarantee fighting violence against women, which would mean that the Constitution would allow violence against women. It's unbelievable, but we have, and we still have, judgments of the European Constitutional Courts that say that this treaty is against their constitution, because the Constitution guarantees family, for instance, or family life. So there's a link that is made between violence against women and the protection of family, as if you have to protect your family, you need to beat your wife. It's quite astonishing, actually, but this shows that we are in this situation where stereotypes, prejudice play still a very important role also in the judiciary, and we need to be aware of that. At the same time, this is a narrative that is used also by the very by populist, and I would say, you see, by populist movements, and I would say also by regimes who would like to eliminate the checks and balances. Mm-hmm. So it's fighting for women's rights today is not about equality. It's beyond that. It's a very essence of democracy again. I always try to link that with democracy. You have understood that. But I really think that it is a matter of the society we want for our children.
Mm-hmm. Before giving the floor to the public, could you help us to navigate, and I would like you to be very pedagogic and didactic, on the architecture of human rights institutions in Europe? Who is doing what and how are they? Yeah.
Everybody's doing everything. I mean, but I think that, well, let's say, it's a paradise for lawyers, actually.
No, that's why I was asking you to please.
Okay, I mean, the human rights, and this is absolutely correct, it should be like that, have to be protected nationally, regionally, internationally, worldwide, so this is not a problem. And it's good to repeat the same thing sometimes, okay? If you say that violence against women is a bad thing and that you need to ratify the Istanbul Convention, the fact that at the same time this is told by national human rights institutions, NGOs, civil society, regional institutions, the Council of Europe, the European Union, and the United Nations can only be good. It would be bad if it would be only one who would say it. But your question has to do, I think, more about what is the distribution of competencies between. Okay, let's say, I'll take the example of the areas where this can be of some practical interest. There is the Convention of Human Rights is an instrument. It's probably the basic instrument and the only instrument that is a response to the Universal Declaration. The Universal Declaration is a declaration. They say this is what we need to respect. And then you have the European Convention of Human Rights, which is a treaty. It's a binding instrument. On declaration, you have rights, and in addition to the rights that are enshrined and obligations of states to respect these rights, you also have a court that decides whether your rights have been respected or not. It's subsidiary. It does not come into play if there is a domestic national system which can protect human rights. The international responsibility only arises when the national protection is not sufficient. Again, perhaps to take an example, if a policeman exercises undue force on during a demonstration, this may be a human rights violation, national. It becomes an international human rights violation if the state says, well done, you did very well, policeman, to exercise disproportionate force. Then it becomes an international issue, and international law has to intervene collectively, by the way. That is the reason why we have international institutions. So it is subsidiary. Now comes the European Union. The European Union is a very bizarre animal. From an international law perspective, it's very... it is at the same time an entity that has some executive power and some legislative power. So, since it has legislative and executive power, some, not much, but some. In principle, it can violate human rights. The Council of Europe does not have any power, legislative or we cannot violate human rights, apart from the human rights of the staff of the Council of Europe, but we cannot violate human rights of others. The European Union can. It can detain people, it can push back people. Now Frontex has also some, for instance, specific competencies. It can impose fines. So it has executive and legislative power. In principle, it should be controlled by international institutions. At the same time, the European Union, because of the principles on which it is based, it also controls its member states. on the areas where it is. So it is at the same time a subject of human rights law, and it can violate human rights law itself, and at the same time it can protect human rights when they are violated, or rule of law, when they are violated by its own member states. And it has a court for that, and the Charter for Fundamental Rights. So that's why I'm saying it is a very strange situation which has never appeared before. I'm not sure that it will appear again, and it is something which is very linked to Europe building, the European integration, as we call it. For the Council of Europe, the key issue is, of course, whether the European Union will accede to Council of Europe conventions or not. One of the issues, as you know, the European Union treaties themselves expect the European Union to accede to the European Convention of Human Rights, which will make the European Court of Human Rights competent to deal with cases against the European Union. It's a very complex issue. It is still discussed. It's not the topic of tonight. I can speak for hours about it, and I am sure that our European Union counterparts in the negotiations can also speak for hours about it. But what is important here is to say that it is important for the European Union, for Europe, not for the Council of Europe, for Europe and the European citizens, that the European Union starts engaging in international law. This shows maturity of the European process, that the European Union should ratify the Istanbul Convention. The European Union should ratify a number of instruments that bind each and every member state of the European Union, and sometimes also of the Council of Europe, for the areas which are under its own competence. And I know that this is a very complicated issue, because there are areas which are under its own competence, there are areas which are under shared competence, areas that escape the EU competence and are still with the competence of member states, and that this is moving also, because every 6 months you may have a different thing. But this is not a reason not to engage internationally. It is strange to feel that the European Union does not bind itself by major treaties of international law. And it should come.
It should be done by consensus, no, of all the member states.
This is a question that you have to put, because now I will not take the risk to say something that is against EU law. You have to put this question to EU lawyers. But I believe that for issues which are under the exclusive competence of the EU, it can.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other idea for the future of human rights protection in Europe? Any reforms that should be addressed, in your view?
Artificial intelligence, I would say, digital transformation. I think that this is a key issue, because it is developing, and in the same way as we have had traditionally competition between security of citizens and liberty, we now have competition between innovation and human rights. Artificial intelligence may be extremely helpful for plenty of things. It may also be detrimental. I mean, if you use it to choose the witnesses, if you use it to choose, I don't know, who can be insured in social care. There are things which need to be discussed. Who is using it, and on the basis of what? And there is a need to have some transparency of the algorithms that are used, despite the fact that the algorithms now, since they are self-learning, it will be difficult to understand how they work and what are the elements that they take into account. I think that this is a major challenge for the future, and perhaps it's not only artificial intelligence, it's actually management of data, of big data. I think that this is something that needs to be addressed And it is a geopolitical issue also, because we needed, on the one hand, to protect the fundamental values on which Europe is built, and at the same time guarantee somehow that there will be no competition from others who would not be willing to follow the same path and will develop very rapidly from the innovation perspective. The Council of Europe is preparing now a framework convention on artificial intelligence. We hope that it will be ready next year. It's a framework convention, so it's mainly principles that will need to be supplemented by more concrete areas, in the specific areas, in sports, in family law, in courts, education, social security, you name it. It's on everything will be governed by artificial intelligence soon, so it is important to have a look at it. And I think that this is a key challenge for each one of us in the coming years. The European Union, by the way, is also looking into it, as always. And this is not what I'm saying now is not denigrating. The Council of Europe has a lot of principles, and we discuss about the principles. The European Union looks into it also from the market economy. So the combination of the two is an extraordinary advantage for the European societies to be able to combine the two. And I think that this is important.
Thank you very much. So we process all what has been said till now. We are on time, so we have 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A.
Hi, I have a comment split into 3 quick questions. First one, do you think that the principles of human rights, as we understand them, can evolution over time? Because don't you think that if the list of human rights, it's a final, closed, fixed text like the Bible or Quran, for some people that agrees, some people that agree with the idea, generally the idea of human rights, but doesn't agree with some items on the list, in the future there's the risk that they will become enemies of the human rights idea as a whole. And I will give you just one example with a question. What would you tell to the Europeans that think that sending a terrorist or a baby raper to prison, it's unfair and it's like a reward for the criminal? Thank you.
We'll pick up 3 or 4 questions and then you can answer all them together.
Bona tarda. 2 preguntes molt ràpides. Una té a veure amb l'estat de salut dels drets humans a Europa. Diguéssim, un no pot evitar de pensar que estem en una situació paradoxal, una ambivalència, perquè és veritat que Europa és un dels llocs millors on hi ha les llibertats individuals protegides i garantides i hi ha una evolució en aquest sentit, però a la vegada també es dona vulneració de drets. I a l'hora de fer una anàlisi avaluatiu on s'inclina la balança, per dir-ho d'una manera, sempre ens trobem amb aquesta situació paradoxal en què hi ha protecció però també hi ha desprotecció, per dir-ho d'una manera. La qüestió aquí, i quan hi ha una ambivalència costa molt sortir amb un balanç en un sentit o un altre, però potser, i això ho han dit molts pensadors, pensadores, en què Europa és una Europa de 2 ànimes, diríem, de vulneració de drets, de barbària, de salvatges, etc., però també d'això. La qüestió aquí, la meva pregunta és, no és que Europa necessita un nou acte fundacional que trenqui amb la seva herència, inèrcia, per agafar 2 exemples, en termes en relació a l'altre, el que té a veure amb tots els racismes que formen part, no diria d'una manera essencial, però al llarg de la història d'Europa, això per una banda, i per l'altra banda la situació de la dona, és a dir, el masclisme, la dominació masculina també és un element que s'ha exercit. No és que hi ha d'haver un acte fundacional en aquest sentit per regenerar, perquè si no la retòrica sobre els drets humans és la via fàcil. I la segona pregunta és sobre, has parlat de l'expulsió de Rússia i el motiu de l'expulsió de Rússia. Tinc entès, si no vaig errat, Israel és un membre observador. No se li expulsa a Israel pel fet de vulneració de drets tal com veiem aquests dies?
Alguna pregunta més? Fem una tercera.
Hi, thank you very much. I am an activist, and you finish your presentation say that there is a good combination between the work of the Council of Europe, that it's always very useful for the activists because we use a lot of your statement, and the combination with the work of the European Commission. But I don't see in reality very much that is a real equilibrium, and there is still a lot of power of lobbies that then deform this nice. So how can we walk a bit further this with a better integration of civil society as a stakeholder, and the less importance of lobbies that then in the Council, European Council, change often this good possibility of collaboration that is in the beginning. Thank you.
So, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for these questions. I will try to combine them as much as possible. I will start with the evolution of human rights, and I think that you are absolutely right. There is evolution of human rights. It is... Shall I take the example of the European Convention of Human Rights, where death penalty is allowed? The European Convention of Human Rights, the basic one, the original one, you can impose death penalty if it is, if the sentence is pronounced by court. But nevertheless, we had several years after prohibition of death penalty. So there is an evolution in the sense. If you look into the first decisions of the European Commission of Human Rights of the early 60s and LGBT issues, you will think that this is completely out of proportion. They are very negative on LGBT rights. Nevertheless, this only came 15, 20 years after the Second World War, where we had a Holocaust, if I may say, also of LGBT. LGBT were in concentration camps. So there is an evolution. There is an evolution, and there is also sometimes an adaptation. Telephone tapping, just to take an example, is not precisely addressed in the European Convention of Human Rights, but it came in very rapidly as part of correspondence. The Pegasus scandal that we have is obvious, something that is considered to be an interference with privacy, communication, and I'm not talking about democracy now, I'll just leave it outside, but it is also something that could not have been envisaged. So there will be adaptations, and it is logical that there are adaptations. Trafficking of human beings, for instance, could be slavery. But when the slavery discussion provisions were adopted, this was not about trafficking of human beings for sexual exploitation, at least. So there is an evolution which comes with the societal evolution. This is inevitable. What is important nonetheless, and why I would say that, and I come also to your question, is it the right time to reconsider some aspects and introduce new elements, a new approach? I would be very cautious about that. I'm not sure that if we tried today to draft the European Convention of Human Rights as it stands, with a court, with the right to individual application and a procedure to implement the judgments, if it would fly. Actually, I think it wouldn't, but don't cite me about that. But I think that there will be a lot of resistance about that, having a court of human rights. It's, by the way, the only one. I'm not sure that we will be able today to draft something about protection of minorities. I'm not sure that we, because I mean, the situation has evolved. I'm not sure that we will be even able to redraft the Istanbul Convention about violence against women today. Strangely enough, the Council of Europe has been able to reach a specific momentum to codify some rules which were acceptable at that time. After the Second World War, the European Convention of Human Rights. In the 60s, the European Social Charter. After the war in Europe, after the fall of the communist regimes and the problems with the protection of minorities, the Framework Convention on the Protection of Minorities. And then the Convention on Trafficking of Human Beings, the Convention on Violence Against Women. So at the same time, the treaties concerning corruption, money laundering, so anti-terrorism. I'm not sure that we would be able to do everything at the moment that issues are burning, a burning issue, you know? Artificial intelligence, why is artificial intelligence a problem? Because it is a burning issue today, and it is very difficult to have a consensus about something. We were able to do the data protection at the time that there were no big data. We were able to do the Cybercrime Convention at the time that the cybercrime was beginning. The principles are there, and we use them still. But it is, and there is a natural evolution in the implementation. But I'm not sure that we would be able to redraft anything now. In particular, not something going as far as creating an international court on human rights to be able to receive individual applications against a member state. I think that this is quite revolutionary, and I'm not sure that we can put that into it. But at the same time, you are absolutely right. There is a discrepancy between the commitment and the reality. That is absolutely true. We have, and in some areas it is very clear, that we have rules and principles, and at the same time we have rules that make the other rules, the initial rules, very difficult to apply. Okay, I think that we are all conscious about that. We discuss about migration, asylum, etc. I think that if you look into the protection system that we have for asylum seekers in Europe, it's absolutely extraordinary. But at the same time, we don't have any avenues for refugees or for asylum seekers to reach this system. The system as such is wonderful. It has remedies.
No, we feel the fences, no?
I mean, if you compare it on paper, it's perfect. And then at the same time, there is a problem for anyone to be able to reach this extraordinary and very progressive system. So there is a divergence between implementation and principles. And that is why we don't have to change the principles, because we have to fight with these principles and not reopen the instruments that we have. At least this is my personal view. Mm-hmm. The expulsion of Israel, which is an observer state. Our observer states do not commit to everything. We have at least two observer states that have still death penalty, the United States and Japan. So I would not engage into the fact that every observer state in the Council of Europe is fully in line with the statute of the Council of Europe. So that would be my reply for this. And you are absolutely right. I'm not competent to reply to your question. I can tell you, because this is essentially about how lobbies and civil society are working in Brussels. What I can tell you is that we try in the Council of Europe, and we are not at all perfect about that, to involve the civil society as much as possible in our endeavors, including treaty preparations, recommendation preparations, soft law or hard law, or whatever. And I think that the civil society, under some of the Council of Europe instruments, has a very prominent role. The social charter is the obvious example. To the extent that you consider trade unions, for instance, as civil society, in my view, they are. They have the right to, in some cases at least, to complain to the European Committee of Social Rights. They have the possibility to complain for their own, when they feel that they are victims of regression of their own rights under the right to freedom of association. They can even intervene before the court, before the European Court of Human Rights, not only when they complain about their own rights, but they can even intervene before the court as amicus curiae, or make a third-party intervention when they want to present their views. They have the possibility to intervene in writing, of course, before the Committee of Ministers. The Committee of Ministers is a Committee of Ministers, so it's very difficult to have NGOs before the Committee of Ministers, but they still have the possibility to communicate with the Committee of Ministers about the execution of the judgments of the court, whether they are sufficiently executed or not, implemented. So there is a real engagement of the civil society in Strasbourg, in the Council of Europe, perhaps not as much as in the side events of the United Nations, but nonetheless, it is, I think, substantial and useful, both for the Council of Europe and for the citizens, I would say, and for Europe more generally. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Mr. Giakoumopoulos, for your words. It was like, I had the feeling it was like in a bubble of peace and being able to think a little bit in this crazy world we are under. You remind me of an international humanitarian law teacher at the law faculty at Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. I was attending her conference some days ago when she was saying that every year it's more hard for me to teach international human rights to the young students at the faculty. But at the end of the day, and she was making a very long, dissertation and very didactic about talking about Gaza and the principle of distinction, and she was like going very detailed in the law. And she said, but at the end of the day, if we had not this, we couldn't speak about impunity neither, and this is an important notion. So I think it was a thing to bear in mind when we think that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you very much for your words. It was an amazing conversation. I ara donarem pas a l'honorable consellera d'Igualtat i Feminismes, Tània Verge Mestre, que ens adreçarà unes paraules de cloenda. Moltes gràcies.
Molt bon vespre a totes i a tots. Com sabeu, hem estat fent actes en els darrers mesos per commemorar aquest 75è aniversari de la Declaració Universal dels Drets Humans, i entre les activitats dutes a terme no podia faltar la que estigués centrada en la recerca, la que partís d'una reflexió, com apuntava el director general per la promoció i defensa dels drets humans, en aquesta recerca necessària, aquesta anàlisi més pausada, que, com veureu, quan tingueu l'ocasió de llegir els articles, és una anàlisi crua, és una anàlisi de la realitat, no hi ha mitges tintes, s'hi diu el que s'hi diu, però també és una crida a l'acció. En tots els casos hi ha recomanacions i crides dels diferents actors. Moltíssimes gràcies el director general pels Drets Humans i l'Estat de Dret del Consell d'Europa, per participar tant en el monogràfic com avui en aquest debat. Cristina, també moltíssimes gràcies per la teva moderació i diàleg d'aquesta conversa i reitero també aquest agraïment al Centre d'Estudis de Temes Contemporanis per aquesta fantàstica feina que feu posant temes d'actualitat a debat i específicament en aquest acte. Mireu, jo quan estava seguint la conversa, aquesta conversa tan interessant, i tots els actes que portem, hi ha una pregunta que ha sortit en més d'una ocasió, també aquests dies que estàvem a Ginebra, en el marc de la commemoració de l'aniversari, i necessitem, al final l'heu acabat responent, que s'aprovaria la Declaració Universal de Drets Humans avui? No. Les feministes fa 20 anys que ens havíem donat aquesta resposta, perquè tenim una plataforma d'acció de Beijing que sabem que es va fent Beijing més 5, més 10, més 15, perquè si es presentés una proposta més àmplia seria tombada. De fet, el risc és a retrocedir respecte al que es té, no a no poder avançar, sinó a retrocedir. Per tant, en aquest context que sabem que hi és, que fa passar a vegades per debats el que són interessos molt diversos, o interessos en tot cas d'imposar un nou ordre. Us haureu trobat a vegades que us plantegin debatem els drets de les persones trans, debatem els drets de les persones migrades. Podem debatre els drets humans a aquest nivell? Podem debatre com els garantim, però debatre si tenen o no drets, o si són drets humans, això és un altre nivell i aquest és una categoria de debat a la que mai ens hauríem de prestar des d'una posició de defensa de drets. Però al mateix temps, des d'aquest call to action que es fa en el monogràfic, des de totes aquestes xerrades que hem anat compartint, crec que hem d'acabar, aquest és un dels darrers actes de la commemoració del 75è aniversari que fem com a Govern de Catalunya, hem d'acabar amb un missatge d'esperança segur, no? Una esperança que va acompanyada de responsabilitat. Jo crec que en aquesta sala el 100% de les persones que hi som activistes, perquè no treballem en una institució que vol fer defensa de drets si no parteixes d'un compromís ferm amb els drets humans. No participes en qualsevol entitat de defensa de drets humans, en l'àmbit de persones migrades, en l'àmbit d'intel·ligència artificial, en l'àmbit de drets de les dones, de les persones LGTBI, si no tens un compromís ferm amb els drets humans. I és a partir d'aquí, d'aquesta voluntat de seguir avançant, que potser, però no és poc, podem acompanyar a les institucions internacionals a tenir governs, societat civil, nous projectes que puguin ser referents, que puguem donar també esperança a tots aquells moviments socials que estan veient com estan perdent drets en els seus països, al marge de si són expulsats del Consell d'Europa o no, o què passa amb la Unió Europea, perquè el Regne Unit avui potser tampoc signaria el Conveni de Ginebra, no? Amb el que està fent, el que vol fer amb Ruanda, és una barbaritat a nivell de drets humans. Per tant, des d'aquest compromís de defensa de drets i entenent també que des de qualsevol institució hem de veure sempre les defensores, siguin persones o entitats defensores dels drets humans, com aliades i mai com una amenaça, perquè són les que ens ajuden a la garantia efectiva dels drets, perquè assenyalen els gaps, assenyalen allí on no estem arribant com a institucions, allí on una persona, un grup social, un col·lectiu nombrós no està veient a les institucions com a prou properes, que no li fan confiança, que genera alienació. Per tant, vosaltres sí que teniu aquesta capacitat d'arribar-hi i, per tant, en un context on els grups antigènere i antidrets, a les primeres persones que estan que estan atacant sou a vosaltres, hem de trobar els governs al capdavant de la defensa de les defensores. Aquest és el pledge, aquest és el compromís que presentàvem a Ginebra aquests dies en la seva dimensió exterior capitanejat, evidentment, pel Departament d'Acció Exterior i de la Unió Europea per poder protegir a les defensores que han de fugir dels seus països perquè la seva vida corre en risc. I un cop aquí poder oferir tot l'acompanyament, sigui emocional, sigui en capacitació, sigui en fer noves i més fortes xarxes, a fer advocacy per la seva causa, que també és una mesura de protecció per a les pròpies defensores, que es conegui més el seu cas, però també ho hem de fer la dimensió interna, i aquesta la capitanegem des d'Igualtat i Feminismes, com defensem a les defensores que actueu aquí, contra els grups antidrets, amb un pla que vam presentar fa aproximadament un any, però que és un document viu i que per ara està obert a les contribucions que pugueu fer, que detecteu de noves necessitats que puguem treballar conjuntament. Per això hem fet també tots aquests actes al territori, perquè si volem que aquesta esperança sigui compartida, necessitem socialitzar tota aquesta reflexió. I també hem de dir que els temes de debat o els drets sobre els quals hem volgut debatre no eren neutres, tenien un posicionament polític per avançar. El dret a una renda bàsica universal, el dret a la participació social i política de les persones migrades, el dret a un envelliment autònom, el dret a una intel·ligència artificial lliure de biaixos, de discriminacions. És a dir, que empenyem perquè aquesta reflexió enriquida per les contribucions a l'àmbit acadèmic, de les entitats defensores, de la participació també de persones de govern, puguem anar com a país tota la una, puguem ser aquest baluard, aquesta punta de llança, perquè ara mateix en tenim la responsabilitat. Deia, totes les activistes que som aquí, perquè ho som totes en les funcions que tenim. I per això també, síndica, presidenta de l'Institut de Drets Humans de Catalunya, estem fent el contrast entre allò que en els darrers 5 anys el govern ha fet en matèria d'implementació del Pla de Drets Humans de Catalunya, per tant, de l'estructura de drets humans de Catalunya, i com recordava també el director general, ens posem ja a preparar l'estratègia de drets humans a nivell nacional pel 2030, que no la farem sols i soles des de govern, que evidentment estarà oberta a la participació, perquè aquesta esperança o és compartida o no serà, i en qualsevol cas, com deia, malgrat aquesta guerra cultural que ens tenen declarada contra les dones, les persones LGTBI i les persones migrades, i al cap i a la fi els drets humans és exactament la mateixa, seguim reivindicant més que mai la Carta Magna de la Humanitat i el seu esperit antifeixista. Moltíssimes gràcies i espero que hagueu gaudit tant d'aquest acte com de la celebració els últims mesos. Moltes gràcies.